It's easy to feel overwhelmed by climate change. Almost every day we hear a report about a new environmental disaster, record-breaking temperatures, or worsening droughts. Such reports remind us that we have to cut our emissions urgently. But the average emissions from a person in a country like Australia or the US add up to only a tiny fraction of the world's emissions. So does it really make any difference if one person or even thousands of people cut their emissions? The answer is yes, it does make a difference, but perhaps not for the reasons you think.
Well, it's easy to draw links between global warming and the fossil fuel industries, such as coal-fired power stations. It may be more of a stretch to see the impact of your own daily activities, such as driving a car. However, one of the reasons why looking at the big players is not going to get you off the ethical hook comes from the risk that your actions can impose on other people. Let's just say, for example, that I'm one of a group of people who are dumping toxic waste into a river, and that, on average, there's one further death from water poisoning for every 4 people who join in. It may never be possible to work out who my actions have actually harmed, but dumping my waste in the river is still wrong. It's wrong because of the risk that I impose. In fact, we can measure that risk in this case. It's a quarter of a death for every person who has joined in. So in order to know whether or not my action is wrong, I don't need to know how much harm it has actually caused. It's enough to know the size of the risk that it imposes on other people.
Okay, so participating in this kind of risky activity is wrong. But you're probably thinking, what's this got to do with me? I'm just one of billions of people producing emissions every day. My impact is tiny.
But actually that's not true. Epidemiologists working with World Health Organization figures estimate that climate change is already causing 300,000 deaths a year, partly from the extra severe weather events that are already occurring, but also because of additional malnutrition and tropical diseases. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the emissions that we're currently putting into the atmosphere will do this harm and remain there for centuries. And when we add up all the harm that will be done over this very long period by the emissions that will continue to be there in the atmosphere, and you ask how much is done on average by each of us, then the answer is, guess what? A quarter of a death.
That's just one house of 4 people living in Australia, whose contribution will be enough to risk the loss of life. So with climate change, even though it's impossible to know whether my daily emissions have harmed anyone, there is a substantial risk that my cumulative lifetime emissions will cause harm. But there is another reason why we ought not to emit, and that has to do with joining in with others who are trying to fix the problem.
Individual action can also be about joining with other people to make a collective difference. A good example of this is paying your taxes. If I fail to pay my taxes, this is unlikely to have any noticeable impact on any public services. After all, I'm only one individual out of many millions of Australian taxpayers. But that's beside the point. I'm failing to contribute on the same terms as everyone else. And the reason that's wrong is that it's unfair. I'm failing to share the burden that's being shared by everybody else. The climate situation, it's a problem that we need to address together. And this requires people like you and me to join in.
In my line of work, I see the impact of collective action, of people coming together to take action together on the issues they care about. I've seen that influence legislative change, policy change, narrative shifting time and time again. This stuff works. So if you are passionate about climate change, if you want climate action, the best thing you can do is participate in a social movement of people who are going to hold this government to account and demand climate action loudly and clearly and urgently.
So even though you are just one of billions of people emitting, do you have a reason to reduce your emissions? Well, the answer is yes, you do. But not simply because you've caused harm, but because you've increased the risk of harm, and because it's unfair if you don't share the burden of helping to fix climate change with others.